You're a relic, Dr. Hale, a relic with shaky hands. The words cut through the teaching ward like a scalpel drawn too deep. Laughter followed, not loud, but sharp enough to wound. The young consultant, Dr. Reeves, smirked as he adjusted his immaculate gloves. Behind him, a group of trainees watched the exchange, half amused, half uneasy. None spoke. None dared. The old man merely blinked once, as if the insult was a draft of air passing through him. Dr. Edmund Hale stood by the doorway, motionless. His posture straightened, not out of pride but habit, the kind carved into a man by years of order and consequence. He said nothing. His eyes wandered over the patient lying on the trolley, a middle-aged officer in dress blues, faint sheen on his forehead, breathing shallow. Hale's gaze fixed on the man's neck, just above the collar, where a small pulse flickered too fast. He saw more in a second than the others did in minutes, but he didn't speak, not yet. Right, Reeves said, briskly. Let's proceed. Major Strickland, isn't it? Internal bleeding suspected. We'll manage. He turned to the nurse. And let's keep the corridor clear. We've got a full audience today. The nurse nodded, glancing at Hale with quiet sympathy. Reeves caught it. And perhaps someone should escort Dr. Hale to the staff lounge. He's earned a rest, hasn't he? A chuckle rippled through the interns. Hale's lips pressed together, pale lines on weathered skin. He did not argue. He simply placed the clipboard on the counter, adjusted his coat, and stepped aside. To anyone watching, he looked like a man yielding to time, but inside, he felt the pulse of something far older, the rhythm of field tents and shouted orders, the memory of hands moving under pressure, not applause. Edmund Hale was 84. Once, in another life, he'd been a medic in the Falklands, stitching torn flesh by lantern light, while mortars whistled overhead. He'd seen men live because he trusted instinct over textbooks, and he'd seen men die because someone hesitated to listen. Now, he was little more than a name on a roster, tolerated for his stories, ignored for his skill. In this place of polished floors and pristine protocols, there was no room for ghosts of old medicine. He walked slowly towards the supply room, each step measured. The corridor smelled faintly of antiseptic and pride. Through the frosted glass of the operating theater, he could still see Reeves moving about, confident, fast, precise. Too fast. The nurse, Elaine Foster, approached him. Her voice was soft, careful. Dr. Hale, you shouldn't take it to heart. He gave a faint smile. At my age, Miss Foster, the heart has little room left for bruises. She hesitated. They shouldn't have spoken like that. He waved her off gently. Let them speak. Words don't stop bleeding. He turned to the shelves, rearranging equipment that didn't need rearranging. It was an old habit, keeping busy to stay unseen. Behind him, the faint hum of conversation continued from the theater. He could hear Reeves narrating each step for the students, his tone sharp with self-assurance. Something in the rhythm was wrong. Hale felt it before he understood it. He looked again through the glass. The officer's chest rose unevenly. Minutes passed. The room filled with noise, suction, instructions, a monitor beeping faster than it should. Reeves frowned, adjusted a clamp, then another. Hale's eyes narrowed. The movement was too high, the incision too wide. He'd seen this pattern before, not in hospitals, but on battlefields, when the wound was deeper than the textbooks predicted. The officer's pulse began to race. Hale took a step forward, hand gripping the doorframe. Clamp the iliac, he said quietly. No one heard. He raised his voice, calm, not loud. The bleed's lower, not upper. Check the iliac. Reeves looked up, irritation flashing. Thank you, doctor, but we'll manage. The word doctor landed like a dismissal. The students shifted awkwardly. One of them, a young man named Harris, stole a glance at Hale, confusion written across his face. Hale stepped back. His eyes dropped to the floor. He had no authority here, not anymore. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling, that sharp, quiet certainty born of repetition and loss. He remembered a soldier once, young and pale, bleeding out from a wound misjudged by an officer who wouldn't listen. History had a way of circling back, dressed in new coats and cleaner rooms. The laughter from earlier lingered in the air, like the smell of sterilizer. Hale looked down at his own hands. They trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from restraint. He pressed them together, steadying the shake, through the glass. Reeves continued, unaware that every choice carried a shadow of consequence. Elaine passed behind him again, whispering, "Are you all right, sir?" He nodded. "I'm fine. It's him I'm worried about." She frowned. "Major Strickland?" Hale's eyes never left the patient. "The man's pulse is too quick, the color's fading under the eyes. It's not the femoral, it's deeper." Elaine looked at him, uncertain. "Should I say something?" He shook his head. "Not yet. He wouldn't hear you." Inside the theater, the light above the table flickered once, briefly. Reeves barked an order. The monitor gave a shrill tone, then settled. For a moment, everything seemed normal again, but Hale felt the unease grow heavier in his chest. He'd learned long ago to trust that feeling. It had saved lives before. He stepped back, leaning against the cool wall. His reflection stared back from the glass, an old man out of place among machines and youth. He looked at the scene beyond. Reeves bent over the officer, the nurse moving fast, the instruments gleaming, all perfect, all wrong. Somewhere inside that room, life hung on a thread no one else could see. And Edmund Hale, stripped of his title and dismissed as a relic, could do nothing but watch, and wait for the moment he knew was coming. He had not meant to move, but the moment arrived like an order he could not ignore. The lights dipped and monitors faltered, the theater filling with sudden, thin panic. Trainees shuffled, breaths held as if they could stall time. Reeves barked instructions, precise and sharp. Voices overlapped, commands crossing like clipped blades. The air tasted of antiseptic and tension, and for a moment the ward's polish felt fragile. Edmund pushed the door and stepped forward. He had no formal claim to authority here, only a certainty honed in worse places. He rolled his sleeves and let his eyes measure the wound, as if reading a map. The officer lay turned, a dark stain at the hip, the dressing failing at the edge. Edmund said, "Pressure on the iliac. Lower, not the femoral." The nurse moved without arguing, fingers finding the spot he indicated. Reeves snapped, "Clamp the femoral." He reached for instruments, sure that hardware could replace hesitation. The clamp bit, but failed to stanch the flow. Instruments help, but they follow the thought that places them. Edmund's hand moved against the officer's abdomen, cool and steady. Lantern light in a memory flashed across him, tense and muffled orders. He asked for a field dressing. Someone produced one, as if from custom rather than stock. He tied the dressing with a pragmatic knot, taught where there is no time for ceremony. He used leverage rather than force, teaching the nurse the fulcrum point with a single quiet word. The maneuver was plain and exact. Minutes felt thick, the beeping steadied in thin stages, color returning slowly to the officer's face. Sweat ran down brows. Reeves watched, lips pressed, the fight between protocol and proof playing behind his eyes. A junior, Harris, moved to prepare theater. "We can take him now," he said, voice bright with hope. Edmund nodded. He had no interest in applause, only in buying time for a proper repair. They shifted the patient with care and brought him to the operating table. A technician rushed in with a battery pack, and a narrow ring of light returned. Machines resumed their hum, and the ward felt ordinary again, though no one quite relaxed. A meeting followed. Reeves presented the event as close calls handled by a team, a tidy narrative that kept reputations intact. It was neat, convenient, and the hospital liked neatness. Yet neat accounts rarely held every small truth. Grainy CCTV offered a different record. The footage showed an old man moving before the formal orders, hands steady on cloth and skin, a deliberate presence amid the flurry. A nurse quietly sent the clip to a senior consultant with the single note, "Watch." Reeves watched the clip. The proof settled like a weight. Pride shifted underfoot. The review room grew quiet as facts met intention, and for once procedure had to bow to evidence. Edmund returned to the supply room, with his hands faintly smelling of blood and soap. Elaine gave him a small nod, a private currency of thanks. Harris avoided his gaze, awkward with the surprise of new truth. Edmund folded his coat and felt a weariness that belonged less to bones and more to memory. The officer's aide arrived with a thin envelope and a request to see the man who had steadied Major Strickland. He found Edmund among jars of gauze and neat stacks of dressings, an old figure at home in a place that hardly recognized him. They went to the ward. Major Strickland lay pale and quiet, eyes blinking at shapes. When he found Edmund, he did not recall a name, only steadiness. "I thought I was done for," he said, voice small. Edmund squeezed the hand briefly, a contact as plain as a secured seam. Reeves stood a pace away, watching with a face altered by a slow recognition. He had learned something uncomfortable about the narrow space between confidence and humility. The students wrote, then stopped, compelled to look up at a man they had dismissed. Edmund left later with a case heavier in memory than instruments. He had not sought acknowledgement, yet the act of stepping forward had made a quiet ripple that reached beyond the ward, to a few hands and a single grainy clip. It was not a victory, it was preservation of a craft. He paused in the corridor, thinking of men he had kept and men he had lost. He thought of knots tied by lamplight and the small precise actions that buy more time than the grand plan. He thought of rules and how an old hand sometimes must bend them for a life. By morning, the clip would have quietly circulated through phones and inboxes. One student would replay it until he could tie the knot without thinking, and someone would whisper Edmund's name not to mock, but to ask how. That night, he walked home with steady steps. The hospital would speak of the event in measured minutes and meetings. Edmund did not know what would come next. For now, the major breathed, and that was enough to sit with until morning. Morning arrived with a muted hush. The clip had moved through pockets and screens overnight, a small, persistent truth. Trainees replayed the knot until their fingers remembered it. Edmund arrived early. Major Strickland read the wall chart, his color steadier than the night before. A staff sergeant sat nearby, hands folded around a lanyard. Edmund kept his distance and watched the room learn itself back to order. Reeves entered with a measured step. He carried the shape of apology without language. He watched the major, then looked at Edmund. For the first time, his posture shifted, as if a map he relied on had redrawn its lines. There was a review with senior staff. Reeves presented the account he had rehearsed, how the team had managed emergent care and the devices that engaged. The board nodded at the tidy version. Routine liked tidy accounts. The consultant played the clip. The room fell quiet around the image of an old hand moving before formal orders. Speech stalled. Procedure bent to the record of action. Reeves sat back, breath flat. He felt a new lesson arrive, the distance between confidence and humility. Outside, trainees whispered. Harris lingered by the door with a notebook, fingers stained with practice. He had not meant to be swept into change. The image on his screen shifted what he believed practice could be. Major Strickland asked to see the man who had steadied him. He did not need a name. He described steadiness and a hand that would not falter. Edmund entered, and the major reached without ceremony. Their exchange was spare. Thanks came in steady breathing and a slow return of color. Reeves came after, carrying a small envelope. Inside was a note, awkwardly penned, asking Edmund to teach the technique, to pass on the knot. It was not a plea for reputation. It was a request for a craft to live on. Edmund felt something loosen inside him. He had done what he had to do. He had not sought recognition, yet the request mattered. He agreed to teach in small moments, beside a bed or in a corridor, showing the knot where practice needed a hand. The sessions were spare and exact. Students watched with a new kind of attention, fingers learning a small economy of movement. The maneuver was simple, and that made it harder to dismiss. It was the sort of efficiency that comes only from years of practice. Reeves attended one session, not to observe theatrically, but to see for himself. He stood to one side and watched Edmund's hands. Afterwards, he approached and offered something like apology. He admitted he had been wrong to mock and asked for instruction. Edmund nodded. Their exchange was brief and real. It was about preservation rather than pride. Word spread in cautious circles. A nurse in another ward tucked a note into a cupboard where field dressings were kept. It read, "Practice this knot. You might need it." Small gestures began to thread through the hospital. Harris taped his sketch of the knot inside his notebook and showed it to a colleague. The colleague tried it in the staff room, hands fumbling until the knot held. They practiced until the action felt like muscle memory. Months later, a call came from a nearby hospital. They asked if Edmund might run a brief workshop. He agreed, willing to give time but not to be the center of ceremony. The workshop was blunt and practical. Students moved pieces as if they were following a map, the knot becoming language. Reeves consulted Edmund more often on odd decisions. Their exchanges were efficient, without fanfare. They did not become friends in the way the young imagine, but they developed a mutual regard that was useful and steady. One evening, Edmund sat at his kitchen table and opened an old wooden box. Inside were photographs, faces stern and mud-smeared. He touched the glass, and the contact was neither longing nor regret, but a continuity. He had not chased glory. He had stitched a habit into a living chain. He kept the sessions spare and practical. He refused medals and speeches. What he wanted was for a simple action to be there when someone needed it. That was the measure he understood. The hospital changed, a little, and then a little more. Procedures gained a margin for experience. Younger staff spoke of field tricks without mockery, a culture that had once prized only the newfound space for the tested. Edmund thought often of men he had kept and men he had lost. He thought of knots tied by lamp and the small precise actions that buy time. He imagined hands learning, a small chain of steadiness stretching forward. On a quiet night, he placed a note in Harris's locker. It read, "Keep practicing." No signature. The next day Harris found it and smiled in a way that belonged to beginnings. He had done the work he meant to do. That was the life he understood. That was enough. He never chased praise. He simply did what needed to be done, even when no one was watching. If you think the world needs more of that kind of courage, stay close. We'll keep telling their stories.